and housing is at the root of so many things, so many problems. So the biggest problem, apart from the obvious major thing of people just not having somewhere affordable to live, is that lack of housing constrains mobility. It stops people from moving to be near their family, near their friends, and from an economic perspective, most importantly, near to job opportunities and near to high-paying, highly productive, high-wage firms.
Welcome to the IEA Podcast. My name is Matthew Lesh. I'm the Head of Public Policy here at the IEA. Each week, this podcast asks a tantalising policy question to a top political and economic thinker. Today's question, is housing reform doomed? Not only has the UK had a new Prime Minister this week, with Rishi Sunak taking the helm, but we've also seen a return of Michael Gove as the Secretary of State for Levelling Up Housing and Communities. This marks the 7th time the Cabinet Secretary for Housing has changed in the last 5 years, with ever-changing reform proposals across the sector. To discuss the state of housing reform, I'm very excited to be joined by John Myers. John is the co-founder of the YIMBY Alliance, the Yes in My Backyard campaign to end the housing crisis. He's also a deep thinker about how to achieve pro-growth policy change. John, I want to start, before we get on to what the new government potentially means, a little bit of a look back at what just happened. I think we're all kind of reeling in a sense of shock about how quickly the Trust project seemed to rise and fall. In particular, there was a big commitment from Trust when it came to building and growing and a focus on housing and infrastructure. What did you make of the discussion from the Trust government? Was it mistaken? Was it hand-fisted? Did it contribute to a downfall? What's your view on all that?
Well, first of all, man, I should say, if you wanted a top political and economic thinker, then I assume they were busy, and that's why you have me instead. But in terms of I think there are enormously interesting lessons to be drawn from what happened with the Truss government. And for this discussion, we should probably set aside the budget and the question of interest rates. And but I think we should remember that budget came out in the process of a market distortion, a market cataclysm, if you will, which was driven by the pension regulator actually going around and encouraging pension funds with people's life savings in them to embark on very highly leveraged arrangements, which resulted in margin calls. Now, we don't know how that budget would have fared in a different environment, but it's clear that we need to fix the regulation that led to those problems. And I personally don't think pension funds should be subject to arrangements where they can get margin calls. So there are kind of regulatory issues that even the free market classical liberal needs to address, because ultimately those pension funds are backed by the taxpayer.
Yeah, but I mean, there's an interesting point there that the regulatory framework effectively encouraged them to have those arrangements to balance their liabilities. But kind of going back into the focus here on housing and planning, which I think was something that didn't get as much focus in the Trust government, but was, I think, genuinely a big part of their agenda, or at least a big intended part of their agenda, if nothing much ended up coming of it in such a short period of time.
Yeah, I mean, look, so I thought it was refreshing, to be honest, the extent to which the Truss government did recognise that land use regulation in this country is a problem and that it needs to be drastically improved, and that would deliver better growth, that would deliver better jobs, that would make our children better off than we are. And it's one of the key reasons why we've had slow growth for so long. And I think the lessons to be learned are how to go about it. And it's interesting, even in the nuance of what they said. So the promise was to ban solar farms on certain additional areas of farmland. You could see, if you will, NIMBY pressures affecting even the Truss government, which is the most gung-ho government for planning reform that I remember seeing. And so, what I think we should take away is that the political pressures on any government are absolutely enormous in terms of planning. And so if we want a better planning system that actually will ultimately deliver plentiful housing, we have to be much more politically clever than anyone has been so far. And we have to make sure that we come up with things that can actually get through Parliament and stick.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point there. It felt like quite a lot of the trust agenda was, from, I suppose, a free market liberal perspective, extremely welcome, necessary. But of course, even if putting aside the mini budget issues and the early collapse of the government, I do wonder if much of it was actually ever going to get anywhere. Was the kind of radical proposals on housing reform, although we don't know what those proposals were, going to get anywhere? There was an early discussion about spinning up infrastructure. Maybe that was kind of minor enough to get somewhere. Like what could have been, or is the truth of it maybe not much could have been because there wasn't enough thinking about the politics?
No, I think there are lots of things that could have been and could still be. I think there's lots of sensible things that could be done on infrastructure. We have completely labyrinthine, Byzantine, nightmarish processes for getting infrastructure approved, including just completely crazy things like the condition that gets imposed on the planning permission for a new generating plant actually gives a maximum megawattage that it's allowed to generate, even if it doesn't change its external appearance at all. There's a certain maximum amount of power, and it has to go back through the entire planning system again if it wants that change. I mean, this is just complete craziness. There is no reason why we should have these things. We have these decade-long processes with tens and thousands of pages, costing absolute obscene amounts of money. And we need to make that all simpler and better. But I think we're not going to manage to make it simpler and better until we recognize the political reality that the people don't like things getting built near them. And you've got to bring people along with you if you want a sustainable system that's going to generate plentiful infrastructure, plentiful housing, without getting politically overturned.
Yeah, well, I think that kind of moves us on quite neatly then to where we think Sunak will go next with planning reform. So during the leadership campaign, Sunak very much talked along those lines, I guess, increasing density in our inner cities, investing in regenerating brownfield land, everyone's favorite, as well as pursuing developments that have community support. And we also saw Gove discuss quite a lot about local aesthetics, local community support for development. What do we already know about his views and potentially then the views of the government when it comes to planning reforms?
Well, we know a fair amount of what Michael Gove thinks because a lot of what he thinks was put into the Levelling Up Bill, which is still going through Parliament. And he is in favour of localism. He is in favour of a better planning system. He is not in favour, as far as we can tell, of sort of radical, huge new towns in the countryside, or it's not clear to me that the investment zone proposals, as they were proposed under the Truss government, are going to go ahead. There's always been an interest. I think Rishi Sunak was one of the earlier proponents of free ports, and so I think we might see some variation of those plans going ahead. It's difficult with that sort of scheme to deliver enormous amounts of housing where it's most in demand. You may get some regeneration around the country, and we did see things like Canary Wharf in London, which had which were analogous to an investment zone when it was first set up, but that was right next to the City of London. It's much more difficult to do that back near my hometown in Lancashire than it is to do it when you've already got a global economic powerhouse right next to you. And so in terms of other things Michael Gove will do, it looks like he'll carry on with the sort of street votes initiative that we've been pushing, which is a way for communities to say yes for more housing where they can see the benefits for them, and it's just a supplement to the existing planning system, so it can't damage any housing that's already coming through. So I'm hopeful he will continue to press on with that. And then there are lots of things he can do in policy. He doesn't need legislation to get more things through. There was an amazing story of there was a Jewish community in South Tottenham who many of whom have large families, many children, and they were absolutely stuck for space. They had families crammed into quite small terraced houses, and so they worked with the local council to create rules on what could be done to add more bedrooms to those houses and give their kids a bedroom each, and that's generated much better results. Really quite well designed houses that have been extended upwards, and that you can just do through planning policy. That's something that the Secretary of State can just sign. So there are lots of things he can still do that he probably hasn't even started on yet before the next election.
Yeah, so it's interesting. Go very much came in as a rejection of a lot of the previous housing white paper, particularly the ones led by Robert Jenrick, to introduce a zonal system where pretty much if local council sets a certain area for growth, or there can't be any further political rejection of development proposals if they're within the rules. And that kind of proposal is gone. But at the same time, something that Gove has supported quite strongly, and I want to go a little bit more detail on, is this idea of street votes, which we've heard talked about increasingly in policy debate. It's something that gets very strong support from people who are in the, I suppose, the YIMBY movement, the pro-housing reform movement, as a way to build local support for housing. At the same time, though, it doesn't always necessarily get an instinctive welcome from planners who see it as potentially a loss of their own control when it comes to what is being developed. Do you want to go into a little bit more about how you can envisage street votes, I guess helping address both concerns when it comes to building more homes, but also local community concerns about too much development?
Yeah, absolutely. And, I should say up front, so credit to Robert Jenrick, who was the first Secretary of State to say that it was government policy to bring street votes in. And so I'm very grateful to him for that. The idea behind street votes is just that there are very, if you look at the areas with the highest housing demand, with the greatest unmet demand for housing, where the price of a house, the price of a home is often 5 times the actual cost of building another home. And so the real constraint is getting planning permission to add more housing. Then communities can add enormous amounts of value if they have additional planning permission to add more homes. And so the idea is to let the communities get some of that value for themselves. And we're proposing a levy where some of that goes for necessary infrastructure, because obviously there are always externalities, there are always collective action problems, but the bulk of those benefits will go to the community themselves. And so the proposal in its very simplest form is, if 2/3 of the residents on the street can agree that they should have additional planning permissions, whether it's just to add additional bedrooms of a certain design, or whether it's to really go for it and add more flats, perhaps add even a granny cottage at the end of their back garden onto an alley, so they're creating a new muse, then they should be able to just do that, and subject to very strict rules to make sure that people on other streets are protected. Why on earth shouldn't they be allowed to do that? Because if that brings enormous benefits to them and it's not harming anyone else, why do we need to impose a lengthy, uncertain and costly process of going through a traditional planning permission, which, by the way, was never ever designed to allow the sort of densification that this is talking about? And I'm just going to disagree with you, by the way, because we have lots of planners who support this idea, and many of the planners I talk to are absolutely sick of dealing with applications for Mrs. Miggins extension, and the planning departments are swamped with applications, and they'd much rather be doing big projects and big sites. And dealing with somebody's extension or an additional flat or additional granny cottage is not why anybody goes into planning, right? So if we can relieve some of the burden of the kind of minor bureaucratic stuff from planners, and also generate more revenue for the council to be able to deal with planning of big sites and site allocation and new master plans, then that's win-win for everybody. And
I think another potential importance of this, particularly at the moment, is in the context of the recession we're walking into. There's already pretty strong evidence that the major developers are reducing their construction because of higher costs and potentially lower demand because of higher interest rates. And that inevitably, after a recession, it tends to help the larger builders, and you see fewer smaller SME builders. Street votes is something that I suppose would both increase economic activity during a potential downturn and help get out of that and kind of go for growth if that's still a goal of the government, but also provide opportunities to those smaller builders to continue operating when there might not be as many bigger developments. There might be a lot of small development opportunities.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And so big builders with large sites will respond very rationally to a downturn in prices, and they will only build at the pace at which they can sell those to meet their targets, and so they will slow down. Whereas a small builder has probably got 1 site or 2 sites, and they will just carry on building, and they might have to take a hit on the price that they get, but that's just the name of the game. They don't have a choice. And so if we can supply lots more small sites for small and medium-sized builders, they will keep going. That will keep the construction industry going, and that will obviously help the economy. Not just in that way. I mean, so with Sam Bowman and Ben Southwood, I wrote big piece called The Housing Theory of Everything. And housing is at the root of so many things, so many problems. So the biggest problem, apart from the obvious major thing of people just not having somewhere affordable to live, is that lack of housing constrains mobility. It stops people from moving to be near their family, near their friends, and from an economic perspective, most importantly, near to job opportunities and near to high-paying, highly productive, high-wage firms who are desperate to grow and to find the workers, but those workers can't find enough housing they can afford near to those firms. And so if we can help to unlock some of that potential, that will of itself just boost growth.
Indeed. And I shouldn't be too snarky in the sense that, of course, one of the interesting things Rishi Sunak did say is, although Liz Truss made mistakes, very much respectful of the goal to go for growth. And I hope we do indeed see some of that agenda continue going forward. I'm kind of interested on that kind of recession point. There is a bit of discourse at the moment. Well, isn't it great? Interest rates are a little bit higher. That means, although maybe it's terrible for people who are currently in a home, have taken out too big a loan and will therefore struggle potentially in hundreds or thousands of pounds extra in mortgage repayments. On the other hand, well, if you're wanting to buy a home, there's going to be a little bit less demand and maybe lower prices. Do you think there's anything to that? Is it good news, higher interest rates for home ownership?
I'm going to knock that one right on the head. So unless you are sitting on a massive pile of cash sufficient to just buy a home without a mortgage, then buying a house has just got more difficult. And it's also got more difficult to fund projects to build more homes because you'll have to pay those interest costs over the period. So that's another piece of damage to the construction industry, to the economy, and to the supply of homes. But if interest rates have gone up, that means that buying has become less affordable, and so it's just not a good economic signal for anybody, except those very few people around the country who happen to be sitting on cash to the value of a house.
Yeah, I mean, you would think for in the longer run, let's say we stabilize at slightly higher interest rates, the impact would probably be neutral in the sense that rather than rather than paying a larger amount to a previous homeowner, you're paying more to the bank in interest repayments, so that the total value of the loan is lower, your interest repayments are higher as a percentage, and therefore you more or less end up going to be paying the same level of mortgages. But I think in the short run, the dynamic is probably a little bit more pessimistic and negative on that.
I mean, I'm not a macroeconomist, but so I do think actually, ideally, if you think of real interest rates as where the schedule of demand hits the schedule of investment projects, you want to have, if you want more housing built, you actually want the financing of those projects to be as cheap as possible. Now, there are a whole lot of other things that interest rates are telling us, and the fact that interest rates have been so low, I would argue, has partly been because we have artificially limited the number of things that you can build, and that you can just walk around almost any expensive city and just find an almost infinite number of places where you could profitably build if only you were allowed to. If we enabled more of those projects, we'd probably have lower real interest rates. But ultimately, setting that aside, higher interest rates do make housing, any housing, less affordable.
Well, and the other element here, of course, is in the rental market, which although is kind of interconnected, is also seeing pretty historically high levels of rental costs, potentially a little bit of discussion about reduction in availability. Now that in some respects seems even more dire, and I'm interested in what your thoughts are on the state of the rental market.
Yeah, it's brutal. If you look at London, for example, Spare Room had some great data they put out on the number of bedrooms that were available for flat shares, and they have plummeted and rents have gone up a lot. I'm just hearing horrific stories of people just desperate even to be able to view a flat that they might eventually rent, and people having to write essays to justify why they'd be the right tenant. All of these crazy things are going on, and it's just an absolutely brutal position to be a private renter right now. And this is obviously one of the major reasons why we need to fix the housing situation, the shortage of housing in places like London.
Yeah, it does also seem like a potential contributor is we've seen a whole bunch of new regulations on landlords, which, although obviously a lot of people who are renting in the first instinct is to welcome some of that, but I think there's also a bit of a risk there that potentially some of the rental problems could get worse if, for example, the government goes ahead as Gove seems to be intent on ending no-fault evictions. Great for existing renters. But at the same time, if you're potentially going to have a decision to make whether or not you're going to buy to rent or let out a property or sell a property, you could end up in a situation where maybe house prices have gone down a little bit because if you're renting and you don't quite have the capital to buy, there does seem to be a bit of a trade-off there in that particular dynamic.
I mean, I think there are trade-offs. I think renters right now are in an absolutely desperate situation, and so I can completely understand that Michael Gove wants to help them. I think it's going to be really critical to see the details of how things like the no-fault eviction work, and whether he can arrive at something that doesn't damage the market, that doesn't damage the supply of new properties to rent. Because I think there have been places in the past where certain kinds of rent regulation or control have backfired quite horribly. So I think it's key that whatever he does that carefully and well.
Yeah, I think that's the general message. Well, hopefully we can be a little bit more optimistic when it comes to next things in this government. There is a relatively short period of time, but in some respects, I think you could make a positive argument here that Simon Clarke might have, although being pro more housing development, would have slowed down some of the potential reforms because he would have had to bring them back, reconsider them, and potentially we might see the levelling up bill going through Parliament a little bit faster, and some of those reforms like street votes coming in a little bit sooner.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to know, right? So I suspect it's not clear to me that investment zones will now be, whether they will be in the levelling up bill or not. Without those, it will undoubtedly be faster. But I thought Simon Clarke is clearly bright. He actually got that you need to find a political pathway through. He really did get that. If you give people big discounts on their energy or even free energy like they do in France in some places, they're going to be much happier about a new power plant near them. And we may not like that sometimes we have to do these deals, but practically speaking, if the way to get energy production or the way to get housing done is to do deals with the locals, then a free marketeer should say, let's do the deals.
I'm personally pro deal. I think that's probably the way through here, which is to try to find kind of cozy and mutually beneficial solutions to housing, and street votes does that quite well. I think when it comes to something like fracking, although the government's put that aside now, I'm paying for locals' energy bills, and the same principle for solar or wind as well, where you can find that mutual agreement is going to be so important.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think wind is a particularly interesting one, because if you look at the polling, some people do get quite upset about new wind turbines near them, but that varies widely around the country, and the same for solar. And in some respects, sometimes it's mainly the second homeowners who get upset about perhaps a solar farm or wind power. So I wouldn't be surprised if you can find swathes of the country where people would be absolutely thrilled to get a new solar farm or a new wind farm near them. And let's remember, the solar farm, you can still have sheep grazing underneath. You're not throwing the farmland away. I mean, personally, I happen to quite like the way wind turbines look. I know opinions differ on it, but I think they're sort of, people love these sort of amazing railway bridges from the Victorian era, and then they look at a wind turbine. Perhaps they'll just get used to them as they age. I don't know. So, I think there's lots to be done there. But the other trick though is with the energy market, and this is the thing people neglect. The other problem with the regulation system that we currently have is that it's extraordinarily difficult to get your new power plant connected to the long distance transmission grid. And so you need to either site that power plant near to where the demand is going to be, or we need to simplify and streamline how we build long distance power lines.
Well, on that kind of positive, optimistic note, to pro solar, pro wind, pro housing, thanks so much for coming on to the IEA podcast, John.
My pleasure. Thank you, Matt.
Well, if you enjoyed that conversation, why not watch one of these other videos? And while you're here, remember to hit the subscribe button and the notification bell. That way, you'll never miss out on a single IEA broadcast.